Hey VC, this is Chris. I'm back to do another video in the family tree series. This is uh, family tree for the Byrds. So in keeping with the previous one, which was Spirit, this is along the lines of Pete Frame's written or illustrated family trees. So I'm going to start out and show different members in the group and how they came together, and some key albums, or not necessarily key albums, but albums along the way. I may skip over some of the obvious albums that everyone is familiar with, but it should illustrate most of the points and show how those groups came together and how they split up and developed along the way. So to start with the Byrds, they sort of had two main groups that made up most of the years. They had some intermediate groups, but primarily they had the starting group, which was Michael Clark and Gene Clark and Roger McGuinn and Chris Hillmen. And then later on there was Roger McGuinn, Skip Batten, Gene Parsons, and Clarence White. So Roger McGuinn stayed throughout the whole thing, but other members changed, and there was an intermediate group, had Gram Parsons in it and some other people. So I'll try to show most of those. So to start out with Roger McGuinn, early on, and he was with the Chad Mitchell Trio. He was known as Jim McGuinn back then, but he was the instrumentalist on this album. They had Chad Mitchell and Mike Kublik and Joe Frazier, who were the three vocalists, and then Roger McGuinn on guitar and banjo. This was 1961 on the Kapp label. And then in the second group we had Clarence White, and he started out in the Kentucky Colonels. So here's Kentucky Colonels, the new sound of bluegrass. This is a reissue on Briar International, and it's from 1962. This was Clarence White. And then Clarence White went on to, he was in Nashville West. This is on the Sierra Records, who produced a lot of Byrds related things. This was 1967, Nashville West. Clarence White, Gib Gilbo, Gene Parsons, and Wayne Moore. And then he was had an album called The White Brothers, which was New Kentucky Colonels. This was 1973. Clarence White and his brother Roland White and Eric White and Alan Mundy. Some of those people would also be in Country Gazette. This album was on Rounder Records. And then Chris Hillmen early on was in the the Scottsville Squirrel Barkers. That's Chris Hillmen over here on mandolin. This is on Crown Records, the Scottsville Squirrel Barkers, 1963. This is kind of beat up, but I found it at a garage sale, unexpectedly, Crown. So that was a pleasant surprise. And then he was with the Hillmen. This is on Together Records. Chris Hillmen, the Gosden brothers, Vernon Rex, and Don Parmley. So there's also a Don Parmley album, Together Records, which has Chris Hillmen on it, which is Bluegrass. The Gosden brothers also put out an album, which is very much along the lines of this country rock, bluegrass stuff. Gram Parsons in the intermediate version of the Byrds. He was, before that, he was in the International Submarine Band, Safe at Home. This is 1967 maybe. Yeah, this is on LHI label. Gram Parsons, LHI. This is a white label promo. And then we get to the Byrds, or pre-Byrds. This is a pre-flight. But this is the whole lineup: Crosby, McGuinn, Hillmen, Clark, and Clark. On Together Records, this is 1964. And then they put out several albums that are pretty familiar to people: Mr. Tambourine Man, Fifth Dimension, others. And then they came along to the intermediate band. Several members had left. Gram Parsons joined. So Sweetheart of the Rodeo. So this is a reissue of their original album, 1968, on Columbia. Gram Parsons, Roger McGuinn, Chris Hillmen are the key players. And then they went on to the next lineup: Clarence White, Gene Parsons, Skip Batten, and Roger McGuinn. This was 1970. This is untitled. This was later reissued on, there was a CD reissue of it, and it included a live concert along with this album. This is on Columbia. So this looks like a reissue also, just on red label Columbia. And then in 1973, the original members all got back together for a reunion album on Asylum. was a gatefold, you know, showing all the band members doing several Neil Young songs and their own music and a Joni Mitchell song. And then the various previous and future members, Skip Batten. In the early 60s, he was in a group called Skip and Flip, which did like surf music or pop music. But here, you know, folk rock. Skip Batten. This is on Signpost label. This is 1972. But there's a Signpost. Clarence White was also on this album. Roger McGuinn, at least on a track. 1979, so post Byrds, Gram Parsons put out an album called Melodies. This is on the Sierra label, and he had various people assisting him. Herb Peterson, Albert Lee, Sierra, 1979. And post Byrds, David Crosby, he produced this album. If only he could remember his name. This is a gatefold. On Atlantic, 1972. He was assisted by a lot of Jefferson Airplane members and some Grateful Dead members. David Crosby. And Gene Clark. There's one, early LA Sessions. This is a reissue of the original album. This was put out in 1972, but it's 1967 songs. This is on Columbia. So he's assisted here by Glenn Campbell, Michael Clark of the Byrds, Doug Dillard, the Gosden Brothers, Chris Hillmen, Van Dyke Parks, Leon Russell, Clarence White. So quite an assortment. Gene Clark, early LA Sessions. It was also issued under another title, which I have a cassette of, but this is the LP version that I have. And then he went on to teamed up with Doug Dillard in Dillard and Clark, Through the Morning, Through the Night. This is on A&M Records. (1969). was this tannish A&M with Byron Burline, Sneaky Pete, Bernie Leadon, and then this sort of a compilation, I think, Roadmaster. This was, I think, 1972. Gene Clark. This has a lot of the Byrds and Flying Burrito Brothers helping him out. This is also on A&M. I think this is produced in several versions. And then he did some work with Carla Olson, who was also with the Textones. They did some good albums. So Rebellious, a Lover. This is on. This one's on Rhino. (1987). Gene Clark and Carla Olson. And then also post Byrds, David Crosby joined this other group. Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and Young in this case. So this is Four-Way Street, 1970. Which is Atlantic. And they put out some other albums. And Roger McGuinn formed his own group. And this is one of the albums he put out post Byrds. Thunderbird. I watched a real good concert the other day on YouTube, which Roger McGuinn Thunderbird. 77 or 78. This album's from 77. I can't remember what the concert was, but yeah, it was very good. This is on Columbia. Picture sleeve. Rick Vito is lead guitarist in this group, who was also briefly in Fleetwood Mac. And then McGuinn teamed up with Gene Clark and Chris Hillmen, and they produced 2 or 3 albums, McGuinn, Clark, and Hillmen. Maybe it was 2 McGuinn, Clark, and Hillmans, and then 1 McGuinn, Clark album. But this is on the Capitol label, 1979, featuring songs by each of the songwriters, since all 3 of them were writing songs. McGuinn, Clark, and Hillmen. And they broke up, and Gene Clark went on to do some other solo work. And parallel to this, Flying Burrito Brothers formed after some of the Byrds left. So Chris Hillman and Michael Clark went on to this group. This is a compilation of their songs from their first 2 albums and some unreleased songs at that point. This was issued in 1974 on A&M. So Bertie Leadon, Sneaky Pete, Gram Parsons, Chris Hillman, and Michael Clark. And then Gram Parsons, after the Burrito Brothers, he went on and he put out 2 albums most people are familiar with, the Grievous Angel and GP. And then this is an EP that he put out in 1973, Gram Parsons and the Fallen Angels. This is on Sierra Records. So side 1 is Gram Parsons, side 2 is some conversations or interviews, and then a Gene Parsons song doing Hot Burrito No. 1, which is a Gram Parsons Chris Etheridge song. And Chris Hillmen always keeps busy, so he joined up with Steve Stills and Manassas, 1972. So this is a double album. On Atlantic. Chris Hillmen, 1972. And then 1984, he started doing solo albums, and this is one of them. Chris Hillmen, Desert Rose. This is on the Sugar Hill label in 1984. And he liked that name so much that he formed another band. This has Herb Peterson helping him out, Bernie Leadon, Byron Berline, so a lot of names we're familiar with. Al Perkins, Glenn Hardin, Jerry Sheff. But 1985 put out this one-off album, Ever Call Ready. This is on the Maranatha label. So Bernie Leadon, Chris Hillmen, Al Perkins, David Mansfield, who I think was on albums with Burnett, T-Bone Burnett, Jerry Sheff. This one on the end. So this is like a gospel album. Bluegrass Gospel, 1985. And then Chris Hillmen went on and he formed the Desert Rose Band, which was the title of the 1984 album, Desert Rose. So this is Chris Hillmen and Herb Peterson and John Jorgensen, 1987. And Desert Rose Band produced 5 or 6 albums. Had some hit radio singles. And then Chris Hillmen continued on and mostly did albums with Herb Peterson and a couple with the Rice Brothers. But so everyone seems like they kept busy if they were still alive. This one was on Curb Records. So that's a brief and incomplete history or family tree of the Byrds. So thanks for watching. Sorry this was so long, but I just kept adding albums to the pile as I figured out, other things that they had all been involved with. So thanks everyone. See you later.